Good evening or good morning to our guests in Australia, and welcome to this very special edition of Oz Talks with Australia's Deputy Head of Mission to the United States, Katrina Cooper, in conversation with Natasha Stott Despoja. My name is Karen Hall and I'm with the Strategic Communications team here in Washington, DC. And very rainy tonight. Before I hand you over to Ambassador Cooper to properly introduce our very special guest, I just want to remind everyone that this Oz Talks interview comes to us under the Women in Leadership banner. Ambassador Cooper initiated and drove DFAT's Women in Leadership initiative, which dramatically increased the number of women in senior leadership roles across the agency. She brought that energy with her when she arrived in Washington, DC as our Deputy Chief in 2017, and the post has a thriving and passionate community that supports women in leadership activities. That's included a number of conversations with female leaders, including just recently Ambassador Cooper's outstanding interview with another incredible woman, Madeleine K. Albright. Sadly, we farewell Ambassador Cooper at the end of this week. I know, right? So soon, but we are so grateful that she's here today to deliver this very exciting Oz Talks interview, and what a great one to finish up on. I will be recording the session, so please remember to keep your mics muted and your video off, and it will be available later this week on the Hub, or you can email me for a watchable file. Ambassador Cooper, thank you very, very much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that kind introduction, and a very, very warm welcome to Natasha Stott Despoja to our series highlighting incredible women in leadership roles. Natasha doesn't really need much introduction because she's extremely well known to all of us, having had many very prominent roles in Australia. She was the youngest woman to serve in the Parliament. She was a leader of a political party. She then went on to be our ambassador for women and girls. And she's currently serving on the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. And she's the first Australian to have done that in almost 30 years. So her career has a huge number of firsts and is incredibly impressive. There are lots of other things that she has done as well, which I'm sure that she will speak to us about. She's also been really active on pushing back against violence against women, and has done an enormous amount of writing in her time. So it's really a terrific opportunity to have a whole hour with Natasha to speak to her about her career and gain her insights and thoughts into what she has done throughout her life, and of course some of the things that she's come across as a woman leader. I'm not sure if we're all on board with the communications. Are we all good, Karen? I'm having trouble seeing Natasha at my end, but it might be my end.
Yes, everything is good. We're all good. Thank you.
Okay, fabulous. Let me know if I'm dropping out. I feel like I've sort of grown up with Natasha. She hasn't grown up with me. I've grown up with her. She's a few years younger than me. And Natasha, I remember the first time, and I think I've mentioned this to you, that I remember seeing your name, or it was an article in the newspaper. It was about you being elected to Parliament, and you had Doc Martens on, and you had your feet up. There was a picture of you with your feet up on the desk, and I was just completely blown away that a woman of 26 had entered Parliament. I think I was about 28, 29 in university, and I really felt like a massive underachiever at the time, and was really intrigued at how you got there and what route you took. So I've never had the opportunity to ask you that. So I'd be really curious to hear from you what led you into politics at such a young age.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Katrina, it's lovely to talk to you, and good evening to everyone in the US. Good morning from Australia. Thank you for that generous introduction. You make me laugh when people say a woman who needs no introduction these days, because everyone under around 35 says, no, trust me, she needs an introduction. Who is she? So I'm really grateful for your kind words for my relevance deprivation syndrome. And what a hard act to follow, seriously. Secretary Albright was your last guest. My goodness, she's wonderful and has been actually very supportive, was very supportive of the CEDAW campaign by Australia when it came to my candidacy. Why and how did I get into politics? I suspect some of you have heard this story before, but really reflects my upbringing. You know, daughter of a single parent who happens to be a feisty feminist journalist, my mother Shirley, a woman with a disability, my mother is deaf, and taught me very early that social justice was important, but also that gender equality was fundamental, and that there were still some discriminations and disadvantages that women faced, not just in public and professional life, but more generally. And she always taught me that it wasn't enough for one woman to get ahead, but really important to ensure that you brought colleagues and friends and women with you. She also taught me, well, really imbued in me a sense that education was the great equaliser, something that I strongly believe. And I see the Malala Yousafzai autobiography on your bookshelf there. Education was fundamental, and my political involvement, both at school and university, coincided with the reintroduction of tertiary fees in the form of the Higher Education Contribution Scheme. So like any good advocate or activist, I was out in the streets and writing submissions and running for positions at the university in order to, what I still believe in, campaign for publicly funded and accessible education. And when I got a job at university, after university, working as a legislative assistant with the Australian Democrats, I wasn't a member of a political party. I just knew that I wanted to help change the world. Naive as it sounds, I still believe that, you know, legislation can change lives for the better. But after a while, people kept saying, why do you keep talking about more young people in politics, or diversity in politics, or more women in Parliament? Why not run? And I did in 1993, and I lost spectacularly in a Senate on a Senate ticket. But my political party at that stage, the Australian Democrats, said, you know what, we're ready to take some bold chances. And when my former leader and senator and my boss, Senator John Coulter, retired on the basis of ill health, I was catapulted into the #1 position in the 96 election. But before that, actually appointed to Parliament in a casual vacancy, November 1995. So it was a combination of good fortune, support from a party, grassroots party, and obviously quite a degree of persistence, and maybe a little naivety as well, now that I look back.
So when you do look back at that, I mean, it is quite extraordinary to be in that sort of leadership role at that early age. Did you feel ready for it? Or were you a little daunted by what lie ahead of you as the leader of a political party?
Oh, I don't think you could be ready for a position like that. Apart from anything, I just remember the first day walking in, yes, with those infamous Doc Martens, and to this day, I still think there's something to be said for a sensible shoe, you know, 30 kilometres of corridor and all of that. But I remember walking into the chamber, and I'd been in the chamber before as an advisor, as a speechwriter. I'd seen how it worked. I had some familiarity with the so-called, you know, red benches. But to walk in, take your place, look around and realise you're the youngest in the room, and let's face it, 26 isn't that young when you're talking about young people as a group, to be one of few females in the entire federal parliament at that stage. Female composition was around 14%, 14.9%. And yes, initially being judged not for arguably a historic occasion, you know, youngest woman gets into parliament, but to see the headlines were actually about my footwear, my hair colour. One journalist spent an entire column on my cheap purple suit. I always look back and think the devil wore Portmans, not Prada, on that day. But it was extraordinary to see some of the superficialities, and some of those I embraced. Don't get me wrong, there was a symbolism attached to the imagery of the docs or being relatively young, and the fact that people didn't quite get that a politician could look different, be different, have a different gender, be relatively young, dress in a certain way. All of these things were challenging, and that symbolism was important. But it certainly taught me very early that there were some ridiculous stereotypes and double standards to which women were subjected in public life and in political life particularly. And as you would all know, sometimes they're hard to shake off, and some of them still linger in our parliament today, unfortunately. And that's parliaments and legislatures across the world, of course.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? And that, of course, hasn't changed. That tendency to judge women on, what they're wearing, what they look like, and so on. And, women leaders across the globe have commented on that. I think it's a really common experience. Did that make you double down and be just committed to doing things your way, or did you feel a little pressure to conform?
Oh, combination of both. It certainly made me double down in the sense that I always did my homework, turned up to my committees. I was a real girly swat, to use that probably inappropriate phrase now, when it came to my private members' bills and legislative work, because I always loved the chamber. I loved legislating. The difficulty with politics is the politics of politics, and certainly, the media. And Karen and I were, exchanging sort of some nostalgic memories earlier about some of the debates that certainly she witnessed as a Federal Press Gallery journalist. But there's also an element of conformity, whether you choose it or not. Some of those images to which you refer, for example, the Doc Martens on the desk, that image is emblazoned in my mind because I remember the photographer setting it up. And I said, look, I probably wouldn't put my feet on a desk. No, it's good for the shot. We get the Doc Martens, you can be on the telephone. And you realise very quickly that sometimes the imagery, the perception of you is created not necessarily in a way that you would choose. Having said that, it's very difficult to go against that system, especially when you feel relatively naive at 26 in dealing with the fourth estate. But I'm sure there'd be critics out there too who would say, hang on, the media worked for you as well. You were able to use it to propagate message and get your policies out there. And I don't shy away from that, and I'm certainly not embarrassed by it. I always saw that publicity as an opportunity, a means to an end, provided at the end of the day what you were selling were the policies, in my case, of my political party. And at that stage, very strongly, passionately committed to issues like sustainability, social justice, accountability, all the things that I've continued to work towards, whether it's in a parliamentary or a political sense or more broadly.
Mm. Well, look, if my response was anything to go by, I actually felt very inspired by that. I was not cool enough to wear Doc Martens. So A, I thought it was really cool. And B, I thought, wow, you can be this sort of strong, as a woman and go into a role that was really, as you say, there weren't many people that looked or acted like you at that time in the chamber. So I found it really inspiring. However that shot came about, the notion of it, I think certainly resonated with me. You mentioned legislating, and I remember having a most fascinating dinner some years back at Parliament House. It was actually the anniversary of our joint standing committee on treaties. So the occasion itself wasn't was irrelevant almost. But I found myself on a table with a lot of mostly women politicians, and I was asking them about being in politics, and they said, this is probably not new to me, but it was new to you, sorry, but it was very new to me at the time. They said, oh, but there are legislators and there are politicians, and we all know who is who. But you were both, I think. You had a very impressive track record of legislating 24 private member bills, including a paid maternity leave and same-sex marriage, amongst other very important ones, but I highlight those for the gender aspect. How did you balance that politicking and legislating? Because you didn't decide to be one or the other. You were actually a very effective politician and a very effective legislator.
Thank you for that. And thank you for noticing the legislative aspect. I think that was the difficulty in getting attention for the nitty-gritty of legislating, the, sometimes seemingly minor amendments that actually did change lives. They were sometimes harder to get attention for than, say, broader policy debates of the day or superficial other issues. I jokingly refer to my career in politics now as sort of like that 1990s shampoo commercial, Pantene. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen. That's how a lot of my private members' bill work seemed to happen. I was, very proud of the paid parental leave legislation in 2002. But of course, we know it took many years. It was under the Gillard government that, in fact, that model was adopted. Same-sex marriage legislation, co-authored by my colleague, former Senator Andrew Bartlett, in 2006. And we know that that took another dozen years. So some of those efforts, they weren't in vain, but at the time it was a challenge to get people interested, let alone private members' bills on genetic privacy and non-discrimination, something that colleagues in America would have a much clearer idea of. And in fact, I'm sure I saw Liz Willis on the call today, and she will remember well my trip to the US to investigate the issues of gene patenting and genetic privacy and discrimination all those years ago, which actually led to a private members' bill and an issue about which I'm still passionate. So yes, I love the combination of the two, and if I could have spent my days in committees all day, I think I would have been oddly happy. I think one of the changes I've seen in Parliament, and certainly there has been a change in the level of, I think, civil discourse generally, but particularly in federal Parliament. The adversarial approach, I think, is quite heightened at the moment. There's a lot of personal comments and deflections. There's an undertone too of, I guess the impact of social media, something that I didn't really have to contend with. I think all of these things have made quite a focus now on the politician element, being a politician, scoring points. I don't see as many people passionate about policy. There are many that are, but it is even harder, I think, today to get specific attention on legislative changes and specific amendments. At least that's my perception, but I do sound a bit like a junkie who, yes, still occasionally listens to the Senate on school runs and, shouts out points of order and what have you. But I do think there is a diminution in some of the behaviour that we see and witness, and that upsets me greatly.
Well, it's interesting you comment on that, because I think for those of us who have lived through these recent years in the United States, we're seeing hyper-partisanship here in the United States. And when I talk to good friends and colleagues about what has changed in US politics over the last several years, they make the point that you're making now, although I would say that it's a little sharper here than it is in Australia. Do you think that trend will continue? And if so, what does that mean for Australian politics?
I don't think the trend is going to change. I think there are a couple of things that make a difference to how we perceive politicians and how our parliament, how effective arguably it is, and that is diversity and difference being reflected and represented, not just more women, but people from all backgrounds. I think that's really important, because I also think that helps engender faith in institutions, decision-making institutions generally, Parliament specifically. I think we're a long way from restoring people's faith in democracy, whether that's in the US or elsewhere at the moment. As you would all know, for the first time in history, we've got the lowest levels of trust in most institutions, whether it's business, whether it's the church, whether it's media, whether it's politics. And that's hard to come back from. It's doable, of course. What the United States has been through is, of course, extraordinary, and you are dealing, contending with some extraordinary issues, including polarisation. But one thing I've always found interesting about the United States system and the legislature and Congress is and you may not see this play out at the moment necessarily, but the fact that the rigidity of the party system, the two-party system in Australia, is almost unlike anything in the world. The lack of conscience votes, as in people being able to split from, being bound by a party view, I think that serves us badly on many occasions. I think the best times I've seen our politics and our parliament operate is when people are actively thinking about, that vote. They've got to make a decision. They've got to give a speech. They've got to read the legislation. It happens so rarely here, much more rarely than you'd think, perhaps. And I think that makes a difference too, when people have to be responsible for the choices they make, for the votes that they cast. That makes a difference. But certainly, I love the idea of not just critical mass of women and different groups reflected and represented. I actually think you need some proportionality in our system before people will actually look at a parliament and say, you know what, I feel that my views are being represented. But having said that, I mean, I know that's sort of a bit of a superficial, because I know that there are so many other issues that are impacting on how we view politics and politicians at the moment. And I think how we view truth and science and evidence-based approaches to anything, be it in the US political system or our own in Australia, I think there have been some really deleterious circumstances. So, yep, but I have to be an optimist. Change is possible, and I have to believe that things will get better, and that politicians hopefully will respond to, if nothing else, the electoral impetus, the fact that people are sick and tired of adversarial, gladiatorial politics. They're sick and tired of the personal jibes and comments. They want change, and hopefully they want change that's not just one electoral cycle to the next, but beyond that. That's what I hope for anyway.
And what would you say, Natasha, to a young person, say your children, when they're a little older, came up to you and said, Mum, I want to go into politics. What would your advice be to them?
Oh, what is it? Don't put your daughter on the stage, Mrs. Worthington. I don't know. I still think that politics can be an honourable profession. It should be. I love the idea of more people considering politics as aspiring to be politicians. It breaks my heart that after some of the recent issues, particularly in Australia, to do with sexual harassment, allegations of assault, and an absolute expose of how badly our parliament deals with, even just a procedural sense, deals with some of those issues. The fact that you've got international surveys that have been done that show in Australia 0% of girls, teenage girls, would consider a political or parliamentary career. That breaks my heart, because my whole working life has been about promoting and supporting women into positions of power and leadership, not just because it's the right thing to do, but as we all know, more women in positions of power has an impact, right down to, measures as simple as profit and loss. In developing nations, we know exactly the impact it has on girls, whether they do fewer chores, they're more likely to pursue education, they're more likely to pursue leadership positions themselves, and play an active role, particularly in conflict resolution, in countries. So it all makes sense, to have more girls and women aspiring to be in those positions, and not just girls and women, young people generally, people from different backgrounds. That's something about which I'm passionate. So I don't want people to be turned off. So what do I say to young people? Just because politics looks like it's given up on you, don't give up on it. And I think that is where the change will come. But diversity, I think, is key. You just can't have career politicians or people from traditional backgrounds, or those who are so elite that the rest of the nation can't even begin to relate to their lives and experiences. It has to be genuinely diverse.
Mm. Mm. And you referred, Natasha, to the recent allegations of assault and sexual harassment, and the revelations. Really, it's really been a domino effect. Did that surprise you? Not the specific allegations, but allegations of this sort. Were you surprised by that, having served in the parliament for so long?
It's a good question. I wasn't surprised that these things had happened, because I remember being a 22-year-old staff member, you know, back in the early 90s. And I remember my own experiences, which were, you know, when you reflect on those experiences, I realised just how awful, whether it was, you know, unwanted advances or comments, let alone being a relatively young senator where, you know, I didn't get into Parliament. There wouldn't have been 1 week, Katrina, that went by without comments on why don't you wear skirts more, or, you know, when you're having a baby, or have you got a boyfriend? And these seemingly sort of small things but demeaning things can be quite debilitating, especially when you're dealing with them and other people aren't, especially when a lot of the male senators are not dealing with those issues, let alone what, you know, Hillary Rodham Clinton calls the, you know, hair and costume comments. So I'm not surprised. I guess the shock was more that it's still going on and the extent to which it was going on. And I think the fact that our parliaments arguably are so far behind other institutions in Australia, including aspects of corporate Australia, where the procedures aren't there. So even if we say that culture arguably exists in all kinds of workplaces, there is a clear difference I have found, and certainly through the work that I do at Our Watch, the Foundation to Prevent Violence Against Women and Their Children in Australia, I've found that business and industry are very keen to have processes in place and codes of conduct, and are very conscious of their legal and usually ethical requirements or obligations. So I think that's what shocked me. The good thing has been, as you all will have witnessed, there's momentum building. You know, on the one hand, you could describe it almost as a reckoning, but if you think in terms of future change, I'm optimistic that there will be change, even if it is simple things like, you know, working with parliaments now to come up with, you know, processes and you know, regulations that better deal with these issues. The longer term change is cultural change. And I thought legislative and policy change was hard. Cultural change is, of course, long-term, or arguably generational. That's hard, but I think there's an appetite for it. At least I, you know, have to believe so.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I mean, one of the things that I found so interesting when I worked on the Women in Leadership Initiative in DFAT, beginning in 2014, was a number of women came up to me to explain, you know, how they'd been engaged in a similar process 5 years before, 10 years before, 15 years before, 20 years before. You know, there was almost this sense that so many times we've been on the cusp of, you know, genuine equality, and it's not as easy as it looks. So I do think there is a role for definitely the next generation, and maybe even the generation after that. I do wonder how much of this is embedded in Australian culture, Natasha. Do you think, you know, you've had the opportunity to work in global roles as the Ambassador for Women and Girls and now on CEDAW. Do you think there is something about the Australian culture that will make it more difficult for us to move towards the sort of genuine gender equity that we see, for example, in some of the Scandinavian countries?
It's interesting. What I do find about Australia is that, you know, our history of progression in relation to women's rights has been paradoxical. And I think there's, when we compare with other countries, whether it was developing nations that I was privileged to visit as Ambassador for Women and Girls, or indeed, yes, some of those countries that are considered, you know, certainly Scandinavian countries and others that, you know, are higher ranking when it comes to the Gender Equality Index. Having said that, of course, no one country in the world has achieved gender equality. But what I found was that we're very proud of some of our early and even in contemporary, you know, history times, you know, some of the changes we've made, legislative and otherwise. So, you know, I'm now sitting in Adelaide, in, you know, the first state in the world to give women the right to stand for Parliament and vote without caveats. So applied to Aboriginal women, as well as non-Indigenous women. That's an extraordinary achievement. Then, of course, it took decades, 40 years before a woman was actually elected. We've been responsible for some of the most world-leading, pioneering legislation, whether it's equal pay, whether it was in relation to sex discrimination, et cetera, but we have not kept at, the same rate and pace of change that you would have expected. So I, meet with someone like the ambassador to the UN, PR to the UN from Timor-Leste, and they'd say, look, we're so embarrassed, Ambassador. We've only got 38% representation of women in our parliaments. And then they would be genuinely shocked to hear that Australia hadn't reached that level of representation in those days. So I do think when you talk about the culture, I think there's a bit of complacency. I think we are the first to say, oh, look, we don't need quotas. We don't need quotas to achieve change because it happens. But the reality is we're slipping down, whether it's the Interparliamentary Union Index of Political Representation, whether it's other measures of gender equality. And that's why we need to turbocharge it. And the only other thing I say on that is, when you talk about how people have done this before, it's a bit Groundhog Day. Indeed it is. And what does make a difference are numbers, not just critical mass, but parity. And so I'm a big believer in making sure that, whether it's quotas or anything else that achieves that kind of change in numbers, particularly in decision-making institutions, and indeed, your top 100 ASX companies, I say bring it on, because we know it makes a difference. And our foreign policy, as you would all know, we actually promote quotas in our region because we know quotas work when it comes to women's representation, not only in politics, but ultimately the policies and legislation that flow from the decisions in those respective parliaments.
Well, interesting reflections. Your parliamentary career then came to an end, and you moved on. How was that? How was it saying goodbye to 13 years in Parliament, and you resigned, I recall, from the leadership? Tell us a little bit about that, because that's quite a difficult thing to do, I think, to step down.
Yes, not many people relinquish power. That's true. Look, I had a relatively long time in Parliament for a minor party person. So to have 2 full terms and a little bit extra was an extraordinary privilege and opportunity. But being a minor party senator, I sort of think of my political career in dog years, because, it's not sort of normal. Minor parties, when there's, 4 of you at the end or 7 or 8 of you before that, you've still got a clutch of portfolios that are extraordinary and, disproportionate number of committee and other responsibilities. And, by the end of my term, I was the only Democrat senator in South Australia. So not only dealing with national portfolios, but I was the one point that people could come to if they wanted a different opinion or help on constituent matters from a non-major party person. So I made the right decision at that time. I mean, I woke up on July the 1st, 2008, with a 4-month-old baby and a 3.5-year-old child, and thought, oh my gosh, this is much harder. But it was, extraordinary, and I had an amazing time. Harder, however, you reflect on my, small, relatively short time as leader of the Democrats in 2001, 2002. And that was an experience like no other. And saying goodbye to that role, which I did step down from because I didn't have majority support of my party room for my my leadership, that was heartbreaking, because I knew that division in politics got you nowhere, and that me stepping down was hopefully one way of salvaging the party, but it didn't work out that way. And I also felt quite proud of the work that I'd done, not me specifically, but I had a really great team of not necessarily politically aligned people. So I had 3 economists and an environmental scientist and, really clever people coming up with innovative legislation and ideas like paid parental leave, and many other things. So I think I look back on that as a very sad period, but also an exciting one. Saying goodbye broke my heart. And it had, I believe, unfortunate consequences leading forward, going forward for the party. But I also learned a lot about the treatment of women and young people in politics. I think if I was leader now, it would be a very different scenario. And often journalists say to me, gosh, we wouldn't have written, a front page story entitled Pert Tits if, we'd been writing in 2020. And I'm not kidding. That's actually one of the front page stories. So I look back with a degree of horror and, things that at the time you just didn't let get to you. I look back now and realise how unacceptable they were. And if I made a mistake, one refrain was, I think she might be in love. And it's like, who says that about a political leader? We all make mistakes, but would you ever say, I think, Prime Minister, he's in love? You just don't. So those double standards I can laugh at now, but at the time were very difficult. And of course, as some of you will remember, the backdrop of the 2001 election, September 11th, the Tampa debate, it was heady times. And, even the Tampa debate, waking up one morning to a detonator being sent in the mail to, in fact, former Ambassador Beazley and myself, waking up one morning and there's a bullet on my home doorstep, needing police protection to get around. They were extraordinary political heady days, and I would not wish for them to be replicated.
Well, that's a disgusting title, and really an insight into just some of the difficulties that that you faced as a woman politician, but also talking about the 9/11 threats as a politician. How did you I don't know if recover is the right word, but how did you sort of mend from that period? Obviously, you had your children, so that must have been very helpful.
Oh, yes, children are so therapeutic. No, I'm kidding. Everyone now these days, my kids are teenagers and driving me nuts, but I can hear they've got the school bus, so we're all good. Look, leaving the leadership, I just threw myself into what I loved and knew best, and that was legislating. I had all I wanted to do was to be a team player and continue as a senator. And I'm proud to say that's what I did. I'm sure there'll be colleagues with different narratives, but I feel quite confident that I wasn't, I do judge former leaders very strongly on how they behave post-leadership. And there'll be some of your friends and mine who will have had, comments from me when they have contemplated, say, a return to politics or a return to leadership. And I think it's really hard to go back. So you've got choices. And my choice was, you know what? I'm not leaving Parliament, so I'm going to be a part of a Senate team that makes a difference. And we did. We continued to do so until we left that chamber in June 2008. And then after that, being able to make a difference without the spotlight, make a difference without the parliamentary opportunities, that's been extraordinary. A learning curve, wonderful opportunities. It's not always the same. For years I would wake up and say, oh, I know what I can do today. I can amend so-and-so's legislation. And then you think, oh, actually, I'm not in Parliament anymore. But I've had the opportunity to work with wonderful not-for-profits from Beyond Blue and the Burnett Institute, Carrie's Beanies for Brain Cancer, and of course now Our Watch. So we can all make differences through our respective, channels, whatever they may be. And of course, the opportunity to serve as a one-time diplomat was, I think one of the most extraordinary opportunities I had, one of the greatest jobs I've ever done. I loved it. And, I won't forget the kindness of you and your colleagues all around the world, and just the passion of diplomats. You all know I'm a big fan of DFAT, and I don't underestimate some of the difficulties you face as well. But I also am proud of our diplomats and how Australia's face to the world, Australia's, representation in the region and the world always made me very, very proud to be an Australian.
Well, thank you, Natasha. And I think you you always conveyed that in your role, and it was a very seamless team, I think, between you and DFAT, and it worked extremely well. And I'm going to tell you something funny that you don't know, but I was called in 2013 to ask if I would be interested in being the ambassador for women and girls. So I spent a couple of months going like this to myself until somebody told me, oh, no, sorry, it's going to be a political appointee. And I went, oh, no. I spent a month or so wondering who on earth was this, political appointee, and then I heard it was going to be you, and I was like, oh, okay, she'll be fine. She'll be great.
Well, I have no doubt that
I think it was a fantastic choice. I was really delighted, and I think everybody DFAT was delighted. There was really a sense of, oh, what an inspired choice. She'll be fabulous. And you were. How did you find that transition? I mean, it wasn't a direct transition, but it's a very different sort of career.
Look, first of all, you would have been a brilliant ambassador for women and girls, and I also know that the eye rolling that understandably happens when you hear those terms, political appointment. So, granted, for me, the idea of combining my passion for foreign affairs and obviously international development with that role, combining those particular passions, they all dovetailed in that job. That for me was just unique and wonderful. And it's really Julie Bishop that deserves any credit or blame, by the way, if anyone's got any concerns, because it was, obviously her idea. The transition or the difference, I'm quite old-fashioned in my views about protocol and my views about politics. I think you can actually be not so much a politician, but a parliamentarian. You don't have to be personal. You don't have to be viciously partisan. And I think in diplomacy, as you will all know better than me, the idea of actually reflecting and representing your country, that opportunity, without doing it in a way that was about point scoring or, partisanship. I really loved that. And also I felt very proud about the policies that we were promoting. The idea that gender equality had, arguably a central role in our foreign policy, that in international development, and I know that you all know the statistics, but, at least 80%, of our budget had to, go to projects that effectively address gender equality in their implementation. I mean, gosh, I've still got the rhetoric, haven't I, folks? But no, I felt proud about that. And while I'll always argue for, and I still believe passionately that we need, additional funds for foreign aid, there's no question about that. And there can be different emphasis on different programs. And I feel passionate about the work in the Pacific and certainly in the South Pacific in that region. A lot more could be done, of course. But I wasn't actually promoting something I didn't believe in. And I got to do something that is the most important thing in my life, and that is promoting, the empowerment of women and girls, and doing so in settings that were sometimes incredibly confronting. And I know many of you have had similar experiences, but whether on, the Syrian border, in refugee camps, or in Bougainville in women's shelters, or in slums in India, but just knowing that foreign aid can make a difference. So I was very fortunate to have that role, and I'm to this day very grateful for the opportunity and for the support that everyone provided. So thank you, Katrina, as well. So maybe next round. Is that what you're going back to? Secrets out.
I'm going. No. That would be a great role. I think it is a really important role, but no, it's not what I'm going back to. I'm going back to a break actually, which I'm really looking forward to. But talking about your role as Ambassador for Women and Girls, and I know we have some parents of young children on listening in, and of course COVID's been particularly difficult and has really brought to the fore juggling young children and career. I remember on one occasion, it must have been, I think, an International Women's Day lunch at Parliament House, and you had your children with you. You were at the main table, obviously. I was at a table nearby. I said, I will keep the children entertained. I didn't really know you very well then. And you've mentioned it to me a couple of times. You've thanked me a couple of times for what to me was a rather insignificant thing. And it made me think about, and it's probably why I offered to do it, having also, you know, been a parent of small children when I was ambassador to Mexico and knowing that sort of tension. But that tension, or not tension is the wrong word, but the sometimes challenge of juggling, you know, being a professional, and it can be a man or a woman, and young children, particularly when they're young, you don't quite know whether they're going to behave or not behave, or hair away, or say the wrong thing. Do you have any, you know, reflections on that, or particularly for people listening in who've had a really hard time in the last year? What's your best tip for managing that juggle? And I mean, it's a lose-lose, I think, through that period where you, you know, you do want to do both things very well, and end up most days feeling like you've done neither particularly well. With a bit of hindsight, you can look back and say, well, you know, they didn't turn out too bad so far. But at the time, it's very wrenching.
Oh, look, jury's still out, Katrina. Yeah, I'm hoping they're turning out okay, but we'll see. Interesting 24 hours in our household. But yeah, debating notes aren't finished, science project not done. Anyway, usual stresses. Look, I think the reality is work-life balance is elusive, and we manage the best we can. Some of us are more fortunate than others that we do have certain support networks or structures, which is why I was always keen, you know, to see, you know, a suite of reforms that actually assisted not just women, but, you know, parents and carers, be they men, women. So I think those kind of structures and actual supports are, you know, so necessary so that we can do what we all really say we want to do, which is actually spend more time with families if that's what we want to do. I think not being judged and not judging is also critical as well. That was probably one of the biggest challenges I had in the parliament, you know, because I had both kids while I was still in office. And some of the comments that were thrown at me, whether it was, you know, that if I really cared about my kids, I'd leave parliament. You know, I used to travel with Conrad for, you know, the 3.5 years he came to parliament with me. And I think people thought he was sort of, you know, in the in tray on my desk or something, because they were criticizing, oh, you know, you should be home with him. Whereas, of course, I had, you know, childcare and support networks. But I have to say, the day I walked into the childcare centre in Parliament House, it opened after I'd left Parliament. I burst into tears because I did think, gosh, this would have changed, certainly would have changed my life. But I think, you know, judgment's a big thing. And yes, I still have very fond memories of you sitting next to Conrad at that IWD breakfast. And very important, as we all know, and this is something we know when we talk about the link between gender inequality and violence against women. You know, some of the underlying drivers of that violence include rigid gender stereotypes and limits to women's independence. And we know that young people need to see women in positions of power, and they don't always have to see hyper-masculine examples of men. So it was important for my kids to see me doing some of those things. But sometimes, yes, it was harder than others. Yeah, but that does still stand out. But then there are also a lot of the parents at the school when I was ambassador, and of course for that role as a thematic ambassador, I travelled a lot. You know, I did 45 country trips during that 3-year period, and I'd have parents say to me at the school gate, oh my gosh, you know, how's your daughter coping? You know, it must be difficult, her mum being away so much. And then, you know, I'd go to India and I'd see girls walking 6 hours to, you know, collect supplies for their families and not being in school. And I thought, you know what, my kids are going to do just fine, you know. So it's all relative, and always one of the motivators for me on policy was to make sure that all men and women had the kind of choices that I've certainly had the opportunity to make in my life and my career.
Interesting. Excellent comments. And talking about judging reminds me of the interview that I did last week with Madeleine Albright. And of course, she's very famous for her saying there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. And I asked her a little bit about that. And judgment was the thing that she brought up as being, you know, the most difficult thing also that she had experienced. Or I should say, perhaps better said, is that if there was one thing that she would ask women to do to help other women, was not to be so judgy. And I think, you know, you've made the same point, and I think it's a really powerful point, a really powerful thing that we can actually all do. It actually doesn't take much not to judge. And I guess the flip side of that is also to stick up for anyone who is judging. I think will be important. But just while we're on that quote, apart from judging or not judging, what do you think would be the other thing that you would say, the other action that we could all take to help other women?
Oh gosh, only one. Look, I am a believer in sisterhood, you know, and I'm, gosh, a great fan of Secretary Albright, and I must reveal that my husband's actually on her advisory group. So there's a lovely connection there where I get to worship from afar, but at the same time, you know, it's wonderful that she's engaged with, you know, embassy events and you know, has that great relationship with Australia. So yeah, sisterhood, very powerful. Networks, always. You will find that in most, you know, the upper echelons of most professions or academia or media or in any decision-making body, whether it's diplomacy, of course, or politics, there's still, you know, not equal numbers of men and women. And I think working together is important, just as I think that rather than what we can do for women, I think men are really important bystanders, to use that word that has become very favourable these days. We all can be better bystanders. You know, we can call out bad behaviour. We can, you know, stop inappropriate comments and sexist attitudes. We can promote and support and mentor and coach and sponsor women into different positions of power or, you know, opportunity. I think there's a role we all can play. And I think, you know, attitudes and behaviours, I know they're not linear, but that's the work or the area in which I work. And I think that makes some of the biggest difference. If we start to understand that we still have some extraordinarily outdated views. You know, a fifth of Australians believe that men make better leaders than women still, because we're apparently too irrational and too emotional. So when you're countering those kind of attitudes, we realise we've got a long way to go, but we can each do something. That's the beauty of it. Just one thing every day. Just think, call out bad behaviour, promote a colleague, intervene if someone's at risk. So many things we can do.
Yeah, no, it's a great list of things to do. And as you say, one thing a day would make a world of difference, difference. We're running out of time, unfortunately, Tasha, and there are two things that I wanted to get to that I haven't. So I'll try and divide this time that we have between these two things. Firstly, your work on domestic violence and on violence I found particularly interesting in Our Watch. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that. And then I really wouldn't want to leave this chat without talking about CEDAW and having a view from you about how important you think that work is, and also about having Australians at the UN, because we haven't had as many in important positions as the UN as we would like to have, and we want to redress that. So why don't we start with your work on domestic violence? And very interested, I know it's been a long abiding interest of yours, and you've done some terrific work on it. Perhaps, you know, what drives you on that, and what do you see as the, you know, the main challenge for us in addressing that in our country, of course, but globally?
I think probably I start where I ended off. I think attitudes and behaviours. So achieving cultural change. Obviously, there are various interventions and support services, be they legal, judicial, psychosocial support that we need to provide for victims and survivors of violence. But I work at the other end, primary prevention, so stopping the violence before it starts. And again, that is a long-term, arguably generational process to really tackle attitudes and behaviours, the underlying drivers. And we know now the evidence base is very clear. The international research is really clear that there is that link between gender inequality and violence against women. So I just see so many things come back to that, you know, when DFAT talks about, you know, promoting, well, women's economic empowerment or women's agency and leadership, et cetera, it's really hard to do any of that when women are facing the fear of violence or living in you know, with violence, whether that's in our home country or across the world. So for me, it's the number one priority. I think it's a national emergency in Australia. Across the world, it's, you know, World Health Organization calls it a, you know, an epidemic, and it is, you know, when you're looking at the high rates of violence against women and girls particularly. So I think attitudes and behaviours, I think that's where we need to start, and that means working in settings, and that's what we do, whether it's relationships, respectful relationships education in schools, whether it's, you know, codes of conduct and cultural change in sporting clubs, whether it's workplaces that have, you know, equality and respect policies and procedures, be they parliament or elsewhere, whether it's in our communities, on our televisions, in our homes. So everywhere that we sort of live, love, learn, work and play, that's where we do a lot of work. I see things changing slowly, but as you would all be aware, the death toll doesn't really change in our country. Every week, on average, a woman is murdered or dies violently, usually at the hands of a former partner or a partner. So it's sobering statistics and haunting work, and I saw it all over the world. So we're not particularly different. What we are different, and you can take heart in, is that we're doing world-leading work. You know, we've shown prevention is possible. We've shown that we can make a difference, and that's the good news. So I am confident in the next decade you'll see a change. In terms of CEDAW, Katrina, oh my gosh, I am so grateful. Thank you everyone for the hard work that was done all over the world. High Commissioners, ambassadors were incredible, and you were all incredible during one of the toughest periods ever. So I will never, you know, be ungrateful. I am a little churlish though, because something that you all know better than me is that my body clock is turned upside down now, because CEDAW sessions, certainly the March, February sessions, were sort of starting at 11 p.m. or midnight and going through the night. So that was interesting, and I wasn't doing it in Geneva as planned, and I suspect I won't be there for a long time, but it was quite grueling, and I'm very much the newbie, but it's wonderful having Australia represented, albeit in the 10th time zone, so I tend to get, you know, the worst times for meetings, but I think people seem very excited to have, you know, an Antipodean represented. There's 23 of us on the committee. There are only 4 new members, one of which, of course, was Australia. So to have that support from the government and from DFAT was just fantastic, and I thank you all. And now I serve as an expert who is independent. So I take that role very seriously, but I have to acknowledge I have had great support from DFAT in the last couple of months with the assistance of an intern. So that's been really appreciated. So, yep, steep learning curve, Katrina, but I look forward to the day where we can meet in person, because Zoom calls are not doing it for CEDAW. And yes, it's been interesting, quite seriously, to see how badly the UN has adapted to the online environment, to the point where we're actually postponing most of the periodic reviews of member states, you know, postponing them for possibly years to come. And that has a huge impact on the rights of women and girls. And also, as you reflected on earlier, the issue of COVID, which of course has completely exacerbated existing inequalities, particularly between men and women, boys and girls. That is a real problem as well. So I think it's going to be an extraordinary 4 years, and my next sessions start in June, although I wake up every morning to a million emails from my lovely colleagues, all of whom are female except for one. There's one man. So maybe next time CEDAW or Australia might put forward a male candidate. Who knows? But I'm not ready to relinquish it yet. Okay, not yet. Let's see how I go. But I might see you in my travels, everyone. I don't know.
We would love that, Natasha. I mean, you were due to speak to us in person on the 13th of March last year. I should have cancelled that event a little earlier. I was trying so hard to hold on to it.
I know.
And then, of course, that was the day that the national emergency was declared in DC. There was, you know, it was just no way that we could go ahead. And I remember you and I having several conversations into the lead up to that about travel and what your plans were and whether you were going to go home or whether you could come down, etc. We did end up having to cancel it. I was really disappointed that we didn't have the opportunity to have you down to talk to us for International Women's Day. I'm really grateful that you were able to find time to do this. Thank you so much. It's been fun. I get packed up tomorrow, so all my books and everything else gets packed up. So thank you so much. But I am absolutely confident that that my colleagues here at the embassy would love to have you come and visit once you're back in the US and CEDAW is meeting in person. We have a Women in Leadership committee. It's very active. And I'm sure that they will be reaching out to you to invite you to come and visit us, do a program here in Washington. I know you've got a lot of friends here in Washington, yes, including your women and ambassadors for women and girls, former colleagues, the Albrights, of course. And I'm sure that we would be absolutely delighted to host you. I know I'm confident in saying that, even though I'm not going to be here. And I hope to catch up with you at some time in Australia. So just thanks so much. It's been tremendous.
Thank you. I remember fondly that morning getting the phone call and trying to work out getting back to Australia, only to have them announce on the flight, this is the first flight that will be subject to quarantine. So it was fine. I did 6 weeks in quarantine last year. It was worth it. CEDAW was the prize at the end of it. But more seriously, I would love to visit. You and your colleagues have always been very kind to me, including at that embassy. I'm not joking, Liz Willis, I'll get back there. And I see Ambassador Miller is on the call, who was hosted me in Denmark. That was perhaps one of the ritzier, shall we say, ambassadorial visits with the wonderful Princess Mary and the Women Deliver conference. But all of you have been very kind. So I look forward to I look forward to catching up with everyone, hopefully in the US, possibly next year. We'll see how we go. But I hope everyone's staying safe and taking care. Katrina, well done on your stellar tenure there, and I look forward to catching up with you in Australia.
Likewise. Thanks again for all you do and all you continue to do and all you've done, Natasha. You're a really great representative of Australia in so many ways, and we're really proud to have you there at the UN on CEDAW. We're really very proud of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.